Hello everybody, welcome back. This is a kind of part 2 video. We were thinking about importing and exporting social work methods in our last video. I want to draw on these ideas and I want to introduce you to a whole bunch of terms which are really interesting concepts but very, very hard to pronounce. I'll try my best. Indigenization, Authentization, and culturally relevant practice. And I found a nice image on Wikipedia of a bunch of people in Greece transplanting a very large looking olive tree. So I'm going to invite you to natter with your partner. What do you think about this image and what relevance does the photo have to our last lesson and to this one? Pause here and scratch your heads collectively. What did you come up with? Well, in our last video, we were discussing the idea of importing and exporting social work methods. And I gave you some words of warning. I noted that it can be linked to process of colonialism. You know, it can be a kind of colonial project. Thinkers, scientists, scholars, practitioners from an economically and politically powerful country trying to give their ideas, their practices to others who are from politically and economically less privileged countries. So we were warning of the dangers there. I think this is another image warning of the dangers related to this transfer of social work methods and knowledge and practices. Indeed, this tree being transplanted gives us a nice metaphor, transplanting a tree. You tear the tree up out of the earth, and you can see the energy and the violence of doing so in this image so well. And then you stick the tree in some other earth, in some other field, and hope that it will still be growing. You hope that it will take root there and flourish and thrive. And obviously, we're well aware this may happen, but it may not at all. It may just die immediately in the coming months. So an interesting image, think about that. And we're going to be using this image to investigate similar ideas to in our last presentation. You know, how much can we transfer social work methods from one place to the next? I want to move on by talking about internationalism in training. Many countries did not or even do not have much social work training. Their professionals train or trained in the past by studying abroad in the global north, you know, typically in Britain or America, for example. They then return to their home country, applying the ideas and the methods that they've picked up there in their training to the social problems, the social situation in their home country. As a variant of this model, you might get students who are trained at home in their country. They don't have to leave the country, but their professors, their lecturers, they had to leave. They had to train elsewhere. Typically, they did their professional training or their PhDs overseas. And I've got a Vietnam passport here because I had a student from Vietnam and he said, I was trained in Vietnam, I got my degree in Vietnam, but my own lecturers were mostly US trained, he said. So I very much kind of sucked up all these US ideas in my own social work background. So that's how it works and that's how it did work in the past. Is this okay? Is this okay? Natter with your neighbour, how do you find this arrangement? What did you come up with? I mean, I guess we have to be pragmatic. If a country doesn't have social work and it wants to establish social work, that country's gonna have to look outside of its country to some extent. But it's a very interesting question, how much? You know, how much could that country be employing its own grown knowledge? In particular, how relaxed should it be with the qualifications of its own natives that haven't done their PhDs overseas? And it goes without saying, every time I send my practitioners overseas for their training, or even for their kind of intellectual stimulus, there's a risk of, you know, contaminating their thinking in terms of bringing in foreign ways of doing things and ways which are not necessarily appropriate to their home culture. So I've already acknowledged that it's happened a lot. This was kind of inevitable, so to say. I really want to stress at this point just how problematic these arrangements are. Let's move on. I'm going to use the word indigenous quite a lot, and because I'm speaking to mostly German native speakers, I really should spend some time clarifying the term, where it comes from. Once again, questions for you to think about with your neighbour. What is indigenous exactly? How do you translate it into German, say? Or how would you define it? Okay, so scratch your heads together. Think about that word. What translations does it have? What meanings does it have? Pause here. Unpause here. Maybe it's nice for me to kick you off with a definition from the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary. Indigenous, belonging to a particular place rather than coming to it from somewhere else. I'm recording this in my home office in Germany, and if I look out of the window, I'll see the Indigenous German school, which is a happy, dark red, chestnut brown coloured creature, and it hops about happily from tree to tree. I've got a whole bunch of them living in our front and back gardens. However, when I was a kid growing up in the UK, if I would have looked out of my window and seen a squirrel, it was actually this cute little monster here, the much larger grey squirrel, which has its roots in America. And it really isn't native to the UK, and it was imported, and it's wonderfully successful in the UK to the extent that you'll almost never see a European red-brown squirrel in the UK. I think you have to go to the little islands to actually find those red squirrels in the United Kingdom. So this is an example of a non-indigenous creature in the UK. You know, this is an invasive species that's come from elsewhere. So the squirrel is not indigenous, it doesn't belong to that particular place, it's come from elsewhere. And we can use the same idea to think about people or even ideas. You may know the word indigenous in other contexts. There is a German translation, indigen, I think we say. Not many of my German friends ever use that term. We sometimes talk about indigenous peoples. And again, the idea is those are the people who are the First Nation peoples. Those are the people who were in that particular place first before others came. And of course, that usage is also related to the colonial history of many countries that we've already discussed. Good, so hold on to the many meanings of that particular word. We'll be using it a lot in the next few minutes. Starting straight away, of course, I want to tell you about a really interesting paper, one of my favorite scientific papers, a paper by Walton and Abu El-Nazar from the late 1980s. And they were looking at a really interesting question. How did the social work profession evolve in their country, Egypt? At first, Western ideas were imported without much reflection. They noted then there was a next phase. These methods were slowly adapted to the very, very different context of Egyptian society. And we talked about this adaptation at the time, and I'm going back now to say the 1960s, with the jargon of indigenization. That was the term we used. Adapting a Western method to fit, in inverted commas, another place. We called that back then indigenization. Please note, the word is a bit of a silly one. It really is quite inappropriate. Although we have this practice in the 60s and the 70s that we described as being indigenized, it certainly wasn't indigenous. So it's a rather strange usage of a term and potentially confusing. I came across the paper, I was referred to the paper by this wonderful text that I read a good few years ago now by Hugman. He was enthusiastic about the paper as well. Hugman defines indigenization as the process in which a set of theories and practices is taken from one part of the world to another and then adapted, changed, transformed to fit the local circumstances. He uses the term to describe how many social workers in the global south have taken social work methods and theory from the global north, from the west. Changing them a little bit, tweaking them, just altering them when necessary to suit the local or the national circumstances of this new place. However, there's something deeply dissatisfying about doing this, isn't there? Social work isn't something that just can be uprooted and stuck elsewhere down in the ground, transplanted and maybe changed a little bit. That's obviously not how it works. Reviving these ideas, Hugman is contrasting indigenization with another concept, authentization. Again, he's taking ideas from this wonderful 80s paper. He defines authentization as the development of forms of social work that are directly appropriate to the local context. In other words, these forms of social work are authentic. So it's a lovely idea in this paper from Egypt, a new authentic social work. Using indigenous knowledge and practice as the starting point, building a new domestic local model of social work using indigenous knowledge and practice as the starting point. So as to be totally authentic, it's real. distinct from imposed external, for example, Western models. There's other words here which I want to share with you. This one comes up quite a lot, contextualization. Hookman notes, very common in China and Hong Kong, this term, describing much the same thing as our authentization idea. Once again, I want you to pause, natter with your partner. Do you like this contextualization? And if so, why? Is it descriptive? Do you find that word is somehow helpful for you to grasp hold of this idea? Pause here. What did you come up with? I personally quite like it. What's in the word, which is quite appropriate, is this idea of context, contexts. And when we're thinking about transferring social work methods, this really is the important point. You know, am I using social work ideas in another place where the contexts of that original idea still fit? Do the contexts fit, or do they not fit? So it's drawing our attention to the really central question here. There you are. I never use it myself, but maybe that's a helpful term. Indigenous social work, it's worth me saying a bit about this because this is a lovely idea, and for the international community, an idea that's come relatively recently. Indigenous social work using the indigenous knowledge and values of indigenous peoples, First Nation peoples. The importance of indigenous knowledge was underlined in our global definition of social work, which we had right at the beginning of this course, if you recall. So going back a fair few weeks now, I gave you that global definition of social work. You can find it quickly by entering it into a search machine. But the 2014 version, the newest version, that actually cited indigenous knowledge as being one of our theory sources for social work. Really, really well-known example here, the idea of the family group conference. If you don't know what this is, enter it into your favorite search machine and read about it. It's really, really interesting. Originally coming from the Maori community in New Zealand, Aotearoa. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, I'm sure I'm not. Not to be confused with indigenized social work. So indigenous social work and indigenized social work are two completely different things. Be careful not to confuse them. Good. Other fascinating terms that are out there. There's actually a whole catalogue of these, and each one has something rich, something else to offer. Decolonizing social work is the title of a book I can thoroughly recommend, a collection of papers by Gray and colleagues from a few years back. They have a broad idea of indigenous peoples. They'd actually worked on indigenous social work in a previous collection of essays. And in this text, they're looking really at all colonized peoples as being, in some sense, indigenous peoples. And they're appealing to the profession, the social work profession, to really acknowledge the past and acknowledge what went on in the past, maybe picking up on Midgley's ideas that I cited in my last video. So they're talking about colonialization. My question for you to natter about with your partner is this colonialization process, is it actually finished now? You know, because all the colonies have all been given back, haven't they? You know, we had this period of decolonization in the post-war years, in the 1940s, the 1950s, and so on. You know, so is this colonization, is it a historic thing, you know, a finished business, so to say? That's the next question I want you to discuss with your partner. Pause here. What did you come up with? Lots of my questions have no right or wrong answer, but here I think there really is an answer which we can stress firmly. Gray and her colleagues would note, colonization is an ongoing thing. That historic political colonization, you know, that doesn't happen now as it did in the past, but we have economic forms of colonization and we have cultural forms of colonization, you know, and these two forms are equally invasive. And again, they're institutionally anchored, for example, by our international economic institutions. So although we're talking about colonization, this makes us think of the past, but we're stressing how much this is an ongoing process, and therefore a process which we have a duty to fight as social work practitioners. Other terms that Gray and colleagues use, here's a couple of nice ones: culturally relevant practice, culturally appropriate practice. Again, I'm still thinking about this wonderful paper from Egypt. Think about the context of Egyptian society. You know, the Egyptians had Western British models of social welfare thrust upon them. You know, that wasn't appropriate to their society. For example, Western welfare is often rooted in Christianity. And you've got a country here which is of Islamic belief. So think about the cultural context in social work, you know, strive to be able to provide culturally relevant practice. And again, I'll let you chew on those terms, think about those terms. I'm moving on though, because I want to close this presentation by linking you to a video which maybe illustrates this nicely. The video deals with education around the area of HIV. So thinking about HIV prevention, thinking about education for that. My exercise for you: discuss with your partner, how does your country do HIV or AIDS awareness? So how does it work? What kind of public campaigns may we have? What kind of information campaigns do we have to get the population aware of safer sex issues, for example? So how does that work in your country, in your home country? Then pick a country that you both know well, maybe a country where you've both traveled to or lived, a country which is not your home country. How could the government carry out HIV awareness there? It tends to be different from place to place. I noticed German and British differences, for example. And then we're going to watch a video, a UNICEF video, that's set in an East African country, okay? Again, quite a different cultural environment. How are you expecting the HIV awareness raising to be carried out there? You know, how might it be in this East African country? Here you are. And the clip is really, really interesting. In the clip, they're using drama as a method to carry out that awareness raising. Have a watch. I think it's really quite fascinating. It's only something like 4 minutes long, and I hope you enjoy that. Hey, let's come to a close. I hope you've enjoyed listening to these two presentations. Thanks for your interest. Cheerio.